Look, we need to talk about something that's been completely mishandled by pretty much everyone involved. The facts are the facts, and we should just deal with them directly instead of all this theatrical nonsense. After a major terrorist attack in 2001, an organization called CARE was founded. The stated reason was that civil liberties were being eroded in response to the attacks. That's the official narrative. Whether you believe that or not depends on your priors. A congresswoman from Minnesota, ILHAN Omar, later referenced this period, saying some people did something. The reaction was intense. People wanted specificity. They wanted her to say exactly who did what. The data is clear on this. 19 members of Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 commercial aircraft and used them as weapons. Total casualties exceeded 3,000 people. Economic damage ran into the billions. These are facts. When you're in a leadership position, precision matters. Words matter. I've learned this the hard way multiple times. When you say something vague about a specific event that killed thousands of people, you're going to get pushback. It's basic cause and effect. Omar's phrase was technically accurate but functionally useless. The specificity gap creates room for interpretation, and interpretation creates conflict. This is predictable. The problem compounds when you consider collective memory. Societies form narratives around traumatic events. These narratives become identity markers. When you challenge or minimize those narratives, you're attacking group identity. The blowback was inevitable, but that's just the beginning. Fast forward to 2024. There's a resolution introduced in Congress to censure Omar. Censure is a formal rebuke. It's not criminal, it's political, but it carries weight in terms of reputation and committee assignments. The specific trigger was a speech Omar gave in Minneapolis in January 2024. According to the resolution, she made statements about representing Somali interests from within the U.S. government. The exact quotes matter here. She allegedly said that Somali Americans had asked her to pressure the U.S. government on behalf of Somalia. She reportedly assured them that the U.S. government would only do what Somalis in the U.S. wanted them to do. They will do what we want, and nothing else. They must follow our orders. That's the quote. Then she said something about safeguarding Somalia's interests, stating that as long as she was in Congress, Somalia would never be in danger, that its waters wouldn't be stolen by Ethiopia, and that people should sleep comfortably knowing she was there to protect Somalia's interests from inside the U.S. system. Now, let's analyze this rationally. If these quotes are accurate, they present a fundamental problem. The role of a U.S. representative is to represent their constituents and uphold the Constitution. Constituents can have diverse backgrounds and interests. Many representatives have ethnic or cultural communities they're connected to. That's normal. The issue arises when you frame your role as protecting a foreign nation's interests from inside the U.S. system. That's a different category entirely. Think about it in terms of incentive structures. If you're a member of Congress, your incentives should be aligned with U.S. interests, filtered through your district's needs and constitutional principles. If you publicly state that your primary goal is to advance another nation's agenda, you're creating a conflict of interest. It's like if I said I was running Tesla, but actually optimizing for a completely different company's benefit. Shareholders would rightfully have a problem with that. Same principle applies here. Voters and colleagues have a legitimate basis for concern when allegiance appears divided. The censure resolution invoked George Washington's farewell address from 1796. Washington warned against divided loyalties. He was clear about this. The language in his address talked about guarding against pretended patriotism and emphasized that citizens should prioritize their identity as Americans over any local or ethnic designation. Washington understood game theory, even if he didn't call it that. He knew that divided loyalties create instability. When multiple principals have claims on an agent's loyalty, the agent's behavior becomes unpredictable and potentially harmful to all parties. You can't maximize for two different utility functions simultaneously when they're in conflict. The resolution argued that Omar violated her oaths by prioritizing foreign interests over American ones. It labeled her actions as those of a foreign agent. A foreign agent, in legal terms, is someone who acts on behalf of a foreign government. The resolution cited Omar's oath as a member of Congress, which requires bearing true faith and allegiance to the United States. It also cited her naturalization oath, which includes explicit renunciation of allegiance to any foreign sovereignty. These are contractual obligations. When you take an oath, you're entering into an agreement. Violating that agreement has consequences. The resolution passed. Omar was censured. She was required to present herself in the well of the House for the pronouncement of censure. The Speaker read the resolution publicly. Beyond the symbolic censure, she was removed from 2 committee assignments, the Budget Committee and the Education Committee. Committee assignments are extremely valuable in Congress. They provide influence, access to information, and ability to shape policy. Losing them is a significant penalty in terms of political capital and effectiveness. The reaction split along predictable lines. One segment saw this as necessary accountability. They viewed Omar's statements as disqualifying. Another segment saw it as political persecution, an attack on a minority woman being punished for representing her community. Both narratives have internal consistency depending on your priors. Here's where the analysis gets interesting. The fundamental question isn't really about Omar specifically. It's about the structural tension between representation and allegiance in a diverse democracy. The United States is built on an interesting contradiction. On one hand, it's a nation of immigrants with the idea that people from anywhere can become American. The proposition is that American identity is based on ideals rather than ethnicity. On the other hand, there's always been anxiety about whether loyalty to those ideals can coexist with maintaining strong ties to countries of origin. In engineering terms, you have competing optimization functions. You want representatives who understand and advocate for diverse communities, including immigrant communities. That requires maintaining cultural connections. But you also want representatives whose primary optimization is for U.S. interests. These objectives can align or conflict. When they conflict, you need clear prioritization. The oath of office is supposed to provide that prioritization. The problem is that interests are complicated. What's in the U.S. interest isn't always obvious. Is it in U.S. interest to maintain good relations with Somalia? Probably, depending on regional stability concerns. Is it in U.S. interest to have representatives who can navigate complex international relationships? Yes. Is it in U.S. interest to have representatives who explicitly state they're optimizing for another country's benefit? That's where the answer becomes no. The framing matters enormously. If Omar had said something like, "I work to ensure U.S. foreign policy considers Somali-American perspectives and promotes stability in Somalia because that benefits both countries," that would be different. That's defensible. It frames the work as advancing U.S. interests through a particular lens. But when you say you're protecting Somalia from inside the U.S. system, the framing implies you're working against U.S. interests. The phrasing suggests infiltration rather than representation. Whether that was her intent or not, that's how it reads. Communication is about transmission and reception. You can intend one thing, but if the receiver decodes it differently, communication has failed. I deal with this constantly. I'll say something that makes perfect sense in my mental model, and it gets interpreted completely differently. Sometimes that's on them, sometimes it's on me for not being clear enough. In a leadership position, especially one with as much scrutiny as Congress, you have to optimize for clarity. Ambiguity creates problems. Let's think about this from a systems perspective. Congress is a complex adaptive system. It has formal rules and informal norms. When someone violates norms, the system has correction mechanisms. Censure is one of those mechanisms. It's relatively rare, which tells you something about how far outside normal bounds the behavior was perceived to be. The system doesn't activate that mechanism for minor infractions. You could argue the system is biased, that it applies different standards based on identity or political affiliation. There's probably some truth to that. But even accounting for bias, there's a threshold question. Did Omar's statements cross a line that would be problematic regardless of who said them? If a white male representative from a conservative district said they were protecting Israel or Ireland from inside the U.S. system, would that be okay? I don't think so. The principle should be content neutral. There's an interesting parallel. Imagine if a tech company executive said they were protecting a foreign competitor from inside the company. That would be grounds for immediate termination. Fiduciary duty matters. The same concept applies to elected officials. They have a fiduciary duty to the United States. That doesn't mean they can't consider how policies affect other countries. But when there's a conflict, U.S. interests have to come first. The broader context involves questions about what it means to be American in a multicultural society. These are genuinely difficult questions. The traditional model was melting pot assimilation. The newer model is more mosaic, where people maintain distinct cultural identities while sharing civic values. Both have trade-offs. What you need is balance that allows cultural maintenance while ensuring civic integration and shared fundamental values. From a game theory standpoint, you can model this as a coordination problem. In a diverse society, you need coordination mechanisms that allow cooperation despite differences. Shared national identity provides that coordination. If subgroups optimize for their own or foreign interests rather than the collective, you get defection. The system breaks down. This is why all functional nations have mechanisms to enforce loyalty. It's not arbitrary. It's necessary for the system to work. The oath of office is particularly important. When you take an oath, you're making a binding commitment. The oath to support and defend the Constitution is very clear. It doesn't say advance the interests of your country of origin. It says allegiance to the United States. That's unambiguous. When you voluntarily take that oath to assume office, you're accepting those terms. Omar took two relevant oaths, the Congressional Oath and the Naturalization Oath. The Naturalization Oath requires renouncing allegiance to any foreign sovereignty. The exact language is comprehensive. It doesn't leave wiggle room. If Omar's statements indicated ongoing political allegiance to Somalia, that's inconsistent with the oath she took. We should consider the possibility that the quotes are taken out of context or mistranslated. That's entirely possible. Language is imprecise. Translation adds another layer of potential error. Without the full speech and proper translation, we're working with incomplete data, but the censure resolution was based on something. Presumably, there was enough evidence to convince a majority of the House. The interesting comparison is to think about how representatives handle other foreign policy issues. Jewish American representatives advocate on Israel issues. Cuban American representatives focus on Cuba policy. Irish American representatives historically cared about Northern Ireland. This is normal and expected, but successful representatives frame their work as advancing U.S. interests. They argue that strong relations benefit America. They don't say they're protecting those countries from inside the U.S. system. The framing keeps them on the right side of the line. Omar could have taken that approach. She could have argued that stable Somalia serves U.S. counterterrorism interests, that helping resolve regional disputes prevents conflict. These are reasonable arguments that frame Somalia advocacy in terms of U.S. interests. If she had made those arguments, there likely wouldn't have been a censure. The problem was the framing that suggested primary loyalty to Somalia. This gets to a broader point about political communication strategy. If you're going to work on controversial issues, you have to be strategic about messaging. You need message discipline. You need to frame your work in terms that mainstream audiences can accept. That doesn't mean selling out, it means translating concerns into broadly acceptable language. This censure is probably bad for Omar's brand with general audiences but might help with her core supporters. Being censured for defending her community could reinforce her credentials as an authentic representative. This is the martyr strategy. Whether it's working depends on whether her district continues supporting her electorally. The institutional memory aspect is interesting. Each censure case becomes part of the historical record and sets precedent. The Omar censure will be cited in future debates about loyalty and representation. It establishes a boundary. Future members will know that certain kinds of statements can trigger institutional response. There's a question about whether Congress should be policing loyalty at all. One view is that loyalty should be enforced through elections. If voters think a representative has divided loyalty, they can vote them out. The counter view is that some standards need institutional enforcement because they're fundamental to the system's functioning. Both views have merit. What's clear is that the case has become symbolic of larger tensions. Omar has become a lightning rod for debates about immigration, assimilation, diversity in government, and the limits of acceptable dissent. She's not just an individual anymore. She's a symbol that different groups project their concerns onto. The actual person gets lost in the symbol. The timing of the censure matters significantly. It happened in 2024, during election year. That affects the political dynamics. Election year censures are inevitably seen as more political because they can affect electoral outcomes. If the censure damages Omar's re-election chances, it could be seen as the majority party using institutional mechanisms to interfere with elections. That's problematic from a democratic norms perspective. On the other hand, if truly problematic behavior occurs, waiting until after an election to address it allows the behavior to continue. There's no clean answer. The timing will always be politically fraught. The media coverage of this whole situation has been predictably polarized. Conservative outlets framed it as finally holding a radical representative accountable for anti-American statements. Progressive outlets framed it as racist persecution of a Muslim woman of color. Centrist outlets tried to both sides it. None of this is surprising. Media coverage reflects audience preferences. Outlets optimize for engagement from their target demographic. Nuanced analysis doesn't drive clicks. Tribal signaling does. So we get two completely different narratives about the same events depending on which media ecosystem you're in. This is one of the fundamental problems with modern information environments. We don't have shared facts anymore. We have competing narrative structures built on selective presentation of facts. Both sides can point to real things that happened, but they arrange them into completely different stories with completely different morals. One side's hero is the other side's villain. One side's accountability is the other side's persecution. There's no neutral arbiter that everyone trusts to adjudicate between competing claims. So we're stuck in a low-trust equilibrium where people believe what confirms their priors and reject what challenges them. The solution to this, in theory, would be institutions that everyone trusts to be fair and neutral. But we're moving in the opposite direction. Trust in institutions is declining across the board. Congress, media, academia, all of them have declining trust scores. When trust collapses, you can't maintain coordination. People defect to their tribal groups because they don't trust the broader system to treat them fairly. This creates a vicious cycle. As trust declines, institutions become more politicized. As they become more politicized, trust declines further. Breaking out of this cycle requires somehow rebuilding institutional legitimacy. I don't have a good answer for how to do that at scale. What I do know is that cases like Omar's don't help. Regardless of the merits, the censure further polarized people. It confirmed existing beliefs on both sides. People who thought she was a problem feel vindicated. People who thought she was being unfairly targeted feel vindicated. Nobody changed their mind. Nobody learned anything. The censure might have served some institutional maintenance function, but it didn't bring people together or create common understanding. If anything, it pushed people further apart. There's a question about whether bringing people together should even be a goal. Maybe the disagreements are real and fundamental, and trying to paper over them with false consensus is counterproductive. Maybe we need to acknowledge that we have deep divisions about what America is and what it should be, and work through those divisions rather than pretending they don't exist. That would require much more honest discourse than we typically get. It would require people to state their actual beliefs and preferences rather than hiding behind euphemisms and strategic ambiguity. Omar, to her credit or detriment depending on your perspective, doesn't seem to hide her beliefs. She says what she thinks, even when it's politically costly. There's something refreshing about that in an environment where most politicians are carefully managed and scripted, but there's also something reckless about it. Politics requires some level of strategic communication. You need to build coalitions. You need to avoid giving your opponents ammunition. You need to maintain enough flexibility to negotiate and compromise. If you're constantly saying provocative things that alienate potential allies, you limit your own effectiveness. The question is what you're optimizing for. If you're optimizing for policy outcomes, you need to play the game strategically. That might mean moderating your rhetoric, building relationships across the aisle, picking your battles carefully. If you're optimizing for movement building and changing the Overton window, you might take a different approach. You might prioritize authenticity and bold statements that energize your base and shift the boundaries of acceptable discourse. Both strategies are legitimate. They just have different costs and benefits. Omar seems to be optimizing for the second strategy. She's willing to take institutional hits in order to maintain credibility with her core supporters and advance a progressive agenda on foreign policy issues. That's a choice. Whether it's working depends on your metrics. She's maintained strong support in her district. She's become a national figure with significant name recognition. She's shifted discourse on certain issues. But she's also been censured, lost committee assignments, and become a target for opponents. The net result is debatable. From a systems design perspective, you want a political system that accommodates different strategies and optimization functions. You don't want everyone to be a bomb thrower because nothing would get done. You don't want everyone to be a compromiser because change would be too slow. You need diversity of approaches. The system should be robust enough to handle representatives like Omar who push boundaries while maintaining enough discipline to prevent actual betrayal of fundamental obligations. Whether the Omar censure represents that balance or overcorrection is the key question. The precedent concerns are real. If censure becomes a routine partisan tool, it loses its power. Censure should be reserved for serious violations that command broad consensus. Otherwise, it's just another party line vote. The test is whether future majorities will cite the Omar censure as justification for censuring members of the opposite party for similar speech. If so, we've entered a new equilibrium where censure is just political hardball rather than institutional maintenance. That would be a degradation of norms. Looking at the specific procedural aspects, the resolution followed formal rules. It was introduced properly, debated, and voted on. The process worked as designed. Omar had opportunity to respond and defend herself. She wasn't denied due process in any meaningful sense. The outcome may have been predetermined by partisan math, but the procedure was followed. That matters for institutional legitimacy. Even when you disagree with an outcome, if the process was fair and transparent, it's legitimate within the system's rules. The George Washington invocation is rhetorically powerful but also somewhat problematic. Washington was dealing with a very different country with very different diversity challenges. Applying his warnings about sectional loyalties to modern immigration and ethnic diversity requires some interpretive leaps. Washington couldn't have anticipated a nation with the demographic makeup America has today. His framework wasn't designed for it. That doesn't mean his insights are irrelevant, but they need to be adapted rather than applied literally. The fundamental insight about needing shared national identity remains valid. Any functioning nation requires sufficient unity around core principles and identity to maintain coordination. The question is how to define that core in a diverse society. What's essential? What's negotiable? These are genuinely hard questions. You need enough unity to function, but enough diversity to be vibrant and adaptive. The balance point is contestable and probably shifts over time as demographics and circumstances change. One thing that's clear is that explicit pledges of loyalty to foreign governments are outside the acceptable range. That's not a controversial boundary. The controversy is whether Omar's statements actually constituted such a pledge or whether they were misunderstood or mischaracterized. Without complete context and reliable translation, reasonable people can disagree. The censure resolution made a judgment. History will evaluate whether that judgment was correct. The Ethiopia-Somalia water dispute that Omar mentioned is actually important context. This is a real issue with real consequences for millions of people. Ethiopia is building the Grand Renaissance Dam and other water projects that affect downstream countries. Somalia is vulnerable. This affects food security, economic development, and regional stability. A U.S. representative from a district with significant Somali population would naturally care about this issue. The question isn't whether she should care, it's how she frames her concern and what actions she takes. Caring about the issue is fine. Promising to protect Somalia from inside the U.S. government is different. The language of protection is revealing. When you say you'll protect a country, you're implying a relationship where you're acting as that country's agent or guardian. That's a very specific relationship that's incompatible with the role of U.S. representative. A U.S. representative can work on policies that benefit multiple countries, including Somalia. But the framing has to be about U.S. interests. The orientation matters. Are you starting from what benefits Somalia and trying to get the U.S. to go along, or starting from what benefits the U.S. and considering how that intersects with Somali interests? The vector direction is critical. This distinction might seem pedantic, but it's actually fundamental. The same policy could be advanced from either orientation, but the underlying loyalty structure is different. If you're genuinely optimizing for U.S. interests, and those interests happen to align with Somali interests on some issues, that's fine. If you're optimizing for Somali interests and using your U.S. position to advance them, that's a betrayal of trust. Intent matters. Framing reveals intent, which is why the framing of Omar's statements caused such strong reaction. The cultural and linguistic context can't be ignored. If Omar was speaking primarily to a Somali audience in a community setting, she might have been using framing and language designed to resonate with that specific audience, without considering how it would read to a general American audience. This is a common mistake. You tailor your message to your immediate audience and forget that everything gets recorded and disseminated widely. In the modern media environment, you always have to assume you're speaking to the broadest possible audience. You can't have secret messaging to your base that contradicts your public positioning. It will get exposed and create problems. The question remains whether Omar's political career survives this censure or whether it marks the beginning of her decline. Historical precedent is mixed. Some censured members have gone on to long careers. Others have been effectively ended. The outcome depends on constituent support, ability to remain effective without committee positions, and whether additional controversies emerge. If this is an isolated incident that Omar learns from and avoids repeating, she'll probably be fine in her safe district. If it's part of a pattern of problematic statements, it could accumulate over time into real political vulnerability. What's undeniable is that this case will be studied and debated for years. It touches on fundamental questions about diversity, loyalty, representation, and the nature of American identity. These questions don't have easy answers. They require ongoing negotiation and adjustment as society evolves. The Omar censure is one data point in that ongoing negotiation. It's not the final word, but it is a significant marker of where the boundaries are currently being drawn. Future representatives will take note and adjust their behavior accordingly. That's how norms propagate and evolve through institutional action. Whether viewed as a symbol of courage or controversy, her name remains inscribed in the nation's conscience, a reminder that in the struggle between conviction and conformity, between heritage and allegiance, between diverse democracy and national unity, truth is never simple, and resolution is never final.